my name's Kaitlyn, and I'm going to be giving you a little background on our topic. An invasive species can be defined as an organism that has altered an ecosystem and potentially become a predator to the natural community's native species, ultimately causing additional selective pressures in that community. Consequences of the invasive species on the natives include evolutionary changes, such as adaptation or hybridization, behavioral and trait shifts, competitive exclusion, as well as an effect on survival rates and even possible extinction. In the paper we reviewed, a study was performed to investigate the effects of an imported invasive as red fire ants here and a prairie lizard here in the shared territory of southeast of the U.S. This specific study released hatchling lizards onto two separate islands with similar environments but different densities of red fire ants. This study attempted to determine if the red fire ants had any type of influence on the lizard's survival rates, phenotypical pattern changes, as well as the population distribution of the lizard habitat use. Next, Karan will be discussing the predictions of our experiment.
Thank you, Kaitlyn, for that awesome introduction. So now we're going to talk about the predictions that this paper had. So the first prediction is based off of an evidence that the fire ants affect vertebrate mortality. So if there are a higher number of fire ants in an area, the number of lizards are going to go down, and vice versa. If the number of fire ants are less in an area, the number of lizards will go up. This brings us to our second prediction that the authors had. Authors said that depending on the density of fire ants in a particular area of an island, that the density of lizards would be affected. So supposedly if 25% of the island is covered with fire ants and it's hugely populated in just one area, the density of lizards will be lower in that area. So this brings to our third prediction. Depending on the environmental conditions, behavioral aspects, and mortality rates, lizards might generate a non-random pattern to protect themselves from the fire ant. So this brings us to our last and fourth prediction that the authors made. Authors said that the lizards will not 100% express their size-related phenotypic traits, which makes them all of the equal size and makes them equally prone to fire ants. So there would be no choice between big or small lizard because they are all the same size. So these were the four predictions that the authors made in this paper. So now Mari will come up and tell us about the assumptions that this paper had.
Thank you, Karan, for your predictions. We're now going to talk about the methods and statistical analysis. So the first experiment focused on 31 prairie lizards that were collected from the wild. They were individually placed in a 40 by 20 by 25 centimeter enclosure, and they were fed 3 times a week until they became lethargic. When they became lethargic, they were given 0.1 to 0.3 milliliters of oxytocin until eggs were produced. The eggs were then separated and the females were released back into the wild. Experiment 2 focused on separating the hatchlings and releasing them at 27 and 30 degrees Celsius onto islands on Lake Owachita. They were released, the first group was released in June while the second group was released in July. And 84 hatchlings were released altogether. The study group then came back in September to 2 to 3 times a day to capture the lizards until they captured all of them. Any that were not captured were then presumed dead. Statistical analysis. The main statistical analysis was to test the differences of the hatchling survival between the lizards and the locations. To calculate the fire ants' density of the release location in a 28-meter mound, the mounds were counted in the local area. The reason there were 28 meters was counted was because that's how far the lizards were able to walk in that area. So what they found out that the p-value was less than 0.5 in the indicated recapture area, and it was a greater distance.
For this experiment, the authors had a couple of assumptions about what the results would be. The first of these assumptions was that incubation temperature would have an effect on the survival rates of the lizards. This is why they had 2 control groups of lizards, one incubated at 27 degrees and the other at 30 degrees. Another assumption that the authors had was that lizard survival rate would be much lower on islands with a higher ant density. They expected the ant populations to have a negative effect on the lizard survival rate. Another assumption made for this experiment was that the fire ants would be evenly distributed among the two islands. They were hoping that the ant populations wouldn't be concentrated in any one area of the map. The authors were also expecting all sizes of lizards to be equally susceptible to predation by the fire ants, meaning that larger lizards with longer limbs would have the same mortality rate as the smaller ones with shorter limbs. And the final assumption that the authors had was that there would be no other predators of the lizards found on either of the islands. Obviously, this would skew the results as where they were trying to look at the relationship between the fire ants and the lizards.
Thank you, Lynn, for the assumptions. Now, my name is Fatima Melendez, and we're going to be talking about selection pressures. The selection pressures of the prairie lizards are experiencing include the invasion of imported red fire ants and their expansion of environmental range in the southeast United States. The fire ant has become an important predator of native species that share similar habitat preferences. The authors measured the pattern and nature of natural selection by conducting experiments that included releasing hatching prairie lizards on two different islands, Big Island and Bone Island, which differed in red fire ant density. Fire ant density was about 8.6 times bigger on Big Island in compared to Bone Island. However, the red fire ant mounds on Big Island were not distributed evenly and mainly clustered in high density in the southeastern and southern portions of the island. In this study, it was demonstrated that the invasive fire ant density did have an effect on hatching lizards' mortality rates between isolated populations and locally within a population. The probability of survival of a prairie lizard on Bone Island with a lower density of red fire ant exceeded the survival rate about 50%. In addition, the study demonstrated that the pattern of natural selection on morphological traits can differ depending on fire ant density. Fire ant density can therefore be said has a direct impact on hatching lizard survivals both within and among populations. Now we're going to move on to Carlos that will give us some questions about the article.
Thank you, Fatima, for your selection pressures. My name is Carlos, and our group developed some questions that the article didn't answer. What if the lizards ate the ants in the less dense fire ants population? What behavior did the lizards develop to maintain a far proximity from the fire ants? Could the fire ants reduce the amount of food eaten by the lizards? Would laying larger amount of eggs that are smaller provide an advantage compared to the larger eggs? The lizards that were released have never been exposed to the wild. Did their domestication inhibit their survival ability? What resources did the fire ants take where they are densely populated compared to when they are scattered? Thank you.